The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac at Marine Corps Air Station Miramar as Captain Jake Morrison adjusted his flight helmet and walked toward the hangar. At 32, he had earned his reputation as one of the finest FA-18 Super Hornet pilots in the squadron, with over 200 combat missions under his belt. His confident stride and easy smile had made him popular among his fellow Marines, but there was something about this particular morning briefing that felt different. The squadron had been buzzing with rumors for weeks about their new pilot assignment. Word had filtered down through the chain of command that they were getting someone special, someone with an unusual background. Morrison had heard whispers in the mess hall about a pilot who had served in multiple theaters, someone with skills that had caught the attention of the Pentagon brass. What he hadn't expected was that this mysterious new addition to their ranks would challenge everything he thought he knew about combat aviation. As Morrison entered the briefing room, he noticed the usual suspects gathered around the coffee machine. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen was reviewing flight plans at the podium, her sharp eyes scanning the morning's mission details. The room hummed with the typical pre-flight energy that every pilot knew well. Conversations about weather conditions, aircraft status, and target coordinates filled the air like a familiar symphony. Then the door opened, and everything changed. The woman who walked in wasn't what anyone expected. She was of medium height with auburn hair pulled back in regulation style, but there was something in her walk that immediately commanded attention. It wasn't arrogance or showmanship. It was the quiet confidence of someone who had been tested in ways that most people couldn't imagine. Her flight suit bore the standard Marine Corps insignia, but Morrison noticed something else. Her ribbon rack told a story that made even seasoned veterans do a double take. Lieutenant Colonel Chen called for attention, and the room fell silent. Morrison found himself studying the newcomer more carefully. There was a calmness about her that seemed almost out of place in the high-energy environment of a fighter squadron. While other pilots fidgeted with their gear or reviewed their notes one last time, she simply stood at ease, her green eyes taking in every detail of the room and its occupants. Chen began the introductions with her typical no-nonsense approach. The new pilot's name was Captain Elena Rodriguez, and she was transferring in from a classified assignment that Chen couldn't discuss in detail. What she could say was that Rodriguez had flown missions in 3 different combat zones and had received commendations that were still under security review. The room stirred with interest, but Rodriguez herself seemed completely unbothered by the attention. Morrison leaned over to his wingman, Lieutenant Tommy Walsh, and whispered, "Think she's ever actually seen combat, or is this just another Pentagon publicity stunt?" Walsh shrugged, but Morrison could see the same skepticism in his eyes that he felt in his own gut. They had both seen too many pilots who looked good on paper but fell apart when the real shooting started. The briefing continued with the usual technical details about their training mission. They would be conducting air-to-air combat exercises over the Pacific, with Rodriguez assigned to Morrison's flight as his wingman. It was standard procedure for new pilots to fly wing until they proved themselves capable of leading their own formations. Morrison felt a familiar surge of responsibility mixed with curiosity. He had trained dozens of pilots over the years, and he prided himself on being able to assess a pilot's capabilities within the first few minutes of flight. As the briefing wrapped up, and pilots began filing out to conduct their pre-flight inspections, Morrison found himself walking alongside Rodriguez. She moved with the same quiet confidence he had noticed earlier, checking her kneeboard and flight charts with the methodical precision of an experienced aviator. Her gear was perfectly arranged, every item in its designated place, but there was nothing obsessive about it. It was the kind of attention to detail that came from having your life depend on those small preparations. Morrison decided to break the ice with some of the casual banter that was common among pilots. "So, Captain Rodriguez," he said with a grin, "what's your call sign?" "Please tell me it's something cooler than rookie or new girl." He expected a laugh, maybe a modest deflection, or perhaps even a slightly defensive response. What he didn't expect was the way her expression changed. Rodriguez stopped walking and turned to face him directly. For a moment, Morrison thought he had somehow offended her, but then he saw something else in her eyes. It wasn't anger or embarrassment. It was something deeper, something that spoke of experiences that most pilots would never face. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but carried a weight that made Morrison pay attention in a way he hadn't anticipated. "They call me Sticky Six," she said simply. The words hit Morrison like a physical blow. Every pilot in the Marine Corps knew that call sign. It was legend, myth, the kind of story that got told in ready rooms around the world, but that most pilots assumed was just another piece of military folklore. Sticky Six was the pilot who had single-handedly held off an entire enemy squadron while protecting a downed rescue helicopter. Sticky Six was the aviator who had flown through a surface-to-air missile barrage that had claimed 3 other aircraft, somehow managing to complete the mission and bring everyone home. But Sticky Six was supposed to be a man. The stories always referred to him and his incredible flying abilities. Morrison felt his world shift as he realized that the legend standing in front of him was not only real, but was a woman who had somehow managed to keep her identity largely classified, even while building a reputation that had become the stuff of military legend. Rodriguez seemed to read the recognition in his eyes, but she didn't elaborate or boast about her achievements. Instead, she simply resumed walking toward the flight line, leaving Morrison to process what he had just learned. As they approached their aircraft, Morrison found himself seeing Rodriguez in an entirely new light. The quiet confidence he had noticed earlier now made perfect sense. This wasn't someone trying to prove herself to a new squadron. This was someone who had already proven everything that needed proving in the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. The pre-flight inspection took on new significance as Morrison watched Rodriguez work around her FA-18. Her movements were economical and precise, each check performed with the kind of thoroughness that came from knowing that attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death. She spoke briefly with the crew chief, asking specific questions about the aircraft's maintenance history and recent performance issues. Morrison realized that she wasn't just checking boxes on a standard inspection list. She was getting to know her machine in the way that only truly exceptional pilots did. As they climbed into their cockpits and began the engine start procedures, Morrison found himself wondering what the day would bring. He had entered the morning thinking he would be evaluating a new pilot's basic capabilities. Now he realized that he was about to fly with someone whose skills had been tested in ways that he could barely imagine. The routine training mission suddenly felt like an opportunity to witness something extraordinary. The radio crackled to life as they received their clearance for takeoff, and Morrison heard Rodriguez acknowledge the tower with the same calm professionalism she had displayed all morning. As they taxied toward the runway, he couldn't help but wonder what stories lay behind that call sign and what he was about to learn about the pilot who had earned it. The morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the runway as 2 FA-18 Super Hornets prepared to take flight, carrying with them a veteran pilot who was about to discover that legends sometimes walked among ordinary Marines. The tower cleared them for takeoff, and Morrison felt the familiar surge of acceleration as his Hornet thundered down the runway. Beside him, Rodriguez's aircraft maintained perfect formation spacing, her technique flawless and seemingly effortless. As they climbed into the clear California sky, Morrison realized that this was going to be unlike any training mission he had ever flown. The pilot flying on his wing carried with her stories of combat that most aviators would never experience, and he was about to discover firsthand why the call sign, Sticky Six, had become the stuff of legend in Marine Corps aviation. As the 2 FA-18 Super Hornets climbed through 10,000 feet, Morrison found himself constantly glancing over at Rodriguez's aircraft. Her flying was textbook perfect, but there was something more to it. While most pilots flew with either rigid precision or casual looseness, Rodriguez seemed to inhabit a middle ground that suggested complete mastery of her machine. Her Hornet moved through the air as if it were an extension of her own body, responding to inputs that Morrison couldn't even detect from his position in the lead aircraft. The air traffic controller vectored them toward their designated training area, a vast expanse of Pacific Ocean where Marine pilots had honed their skills for decades. Morrison was leading today's exercise, a basic air-to-air intercept scenario that would give him a chance to evaluate Rodriguez's capabilities without putting either of them at risk. At least, that had been his original plan. Now, knowing who was flying on his wing, he wondered if he should adjust the difficulty level of their training engagement. Sticky Six. "How long since your last air-to-air engagement?" Morrison asked over the radio, using her call sign for the first time. The words felt strange coming out of his mouth, like invoking the name of a ghost or a character from a story he had heard too many times to believe. "Define engagement," Rodriguez replied, her voice calm and professional over the radio. If you mean training exercise, about 3 weeks ago. If you mean someone actually shooting at me, that would be 6 months and 4 days. The matter-of-fact way she delivered that information sent a chill down Morrison's spine. 6 months ago, he had been flying routine patrols off the coast of California, complaining about the predictability of peacetime operations. Apparently, Rodriguez had been somewhere far more dangerous, dealing with situations where the missiles were real and the consequences of failure were measured in lives rather than training scores. They reached the training area, and Morrison began setting up the scenario. According to the exercise parameters, he would play the role of an enemy aircraft, while Rodriguez attempted to intercept and engage him. It was a basic training evolution that every Marine pilot had done hundreds of times. But Morrison found himself approaching it with unusual curiosity. He wanted to see how the pilot behind the Sticky 6 legend would handle a tactical situation. "Sticky 6, you are cleared to engage," Morrison announced over the radio. "Show me what you've got." What happened next redefined everything Morrison thought he knew about air combat. Rodriguez's Hornet seemed to come alive in ways that Morrison had never witnessed before. She didn't just maneuver her aircraft, she seemed to dance with it, through three-dimensional space. Her approach wasn't textbook, but it was devastatingly effective. Instead of the standard intercept profile that Morrison expected, Rodriguez executed a series of maneuvers that put her in a position Morrison hadn't even realized was possible. Within 30 seconds, she had turned the tables completely. Morrison found himself defensive, trying to counter moves that seemed to come from nowhere. Rodriguez's Hornet appeared in his mirrors when it should have been impossible, disappeared from his radar when he thought he had a solid lock, and consistently stayed one step ahead of every defensive maneuver Morrison attempted. "Where did you learn to fly like that?" Morrison asked, breathing heavily as he tried to regain some semblance of tactical advantage. "Afghanistan," Rodriguez replied simply, her voice showing no signs of the exertion that Morrison was feeling. "When you're outnumbered 4-1 and your wingman is already down, you learn to think differently about what's possible." The simple statement hit Morrison like a revelation. He had always approached air combat as a chess match, a series of moves and countermoves governed by established tactics and procedures. Rodriguez was playing an entirely different game, one where the rules had been written by necessity and survival rather than training manuals and doctrine. They continued the engagement for another 20 minutes, and Morrison found himself being systematically outflown by techniques he had never seen before. Rodriguez wasn't just better than him. She was operating on a completely different level. Her spatial awareness seemed almost supernatural. Her timing was perfect, and her understanding of her aircraft's capabilities appeared to extend far beyond anything Morrison had encountered in his years of training other pilots. Finally, Morrison called a halt to the exercise. His fuel was running low, and his ego was running even lower. "Sticky 6, let's head home," he said over the radio. "I think I've learned enough for one day." As they formed up for the flight back to Miramar, Morrison found himself studying Rodriguez's flying even more intently. Now that he knew what she was capable of, he began to notice subtleties that he had missed earlier. The way she adjusted her power settings was more nuanced than standard technique suggested. Her formation flying wasn't just precise, it was effortless in a way that spoke of thousands of hours in combat situations where precision meant survival. "Rodriguez," Morrison said over the radio, "I need to ask you something." "Go ahead," she replied. "The stories about Sticky 6 about holding off an entire enemy squadron while protecting a rescue helicopter, those stories are true, aren't they?" There was a long pause before Rodriguez responded. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that Morrison was beginning to recognize as the mark of someone who had seen combat in its rawest form. "September 15th, 2 years ago," she said. "We were providing close air support for a special operations team that had been compromised. Their extraction helicopter took ground fire and went down in a valley surrounded by enemy positions. The rescue bird was coming in hot, but they were facing coordinated surface-to-air missile threats, and at least 6 enemy aircraft." Morrison listened in silence as Rodriguez continued her account, her voice steady but heavy with memory. "My wingman took a missile hit 30 seconds into the engagement. His aircraft was damaged but flyable, so I ordered him to egress while I maintained cover for the rescue operation. That left me alone against odds that weren't exactly favorable." The understatement in her voice spoke volumes about the kind of person Rodriguez was. Morrison had heard enough combat stories to know that not exactly favorable probably meant suicidal odds that most pilots wouldn't have survived. The rescue helicopter needed 12 minutes on the ground to extract the special ops team and recover the crew from the downed bird, Rodriguez continued. I had to keep 6 enemy fighters and multiple surface-to-air missile sites busy for 12 minutes while flying alone and critically low on fuel. Morrison tried to imagine the scenario Rodriguez was describing. A single Marine pilot outnumbered 6-1, facing coordinated enemy air and ground threats while protecting helpless personnel on the ground. It was the kind of situation that doctrine said was unwinnable, the kind of engagement where survival was measured in seconds rather than minutes. "How did you do it?" Morrison asked, though he wasn't sure he really wanted to know the answer. "I stopped thinking like a pilot and started thinking like prey," Rodriguez replied. "When you're outnumbered that badly, you can't fight a conventional engagement. You have to make them fight your fight, on your terms. I used terrain. I used weather. I used their own numbers against them. I made them chase me through canyons where their numbers didn't matter, forced them into situations where they couldn't coordinate their attacks." Morrison was beginning to understand why Rodriguez's flying had seemed so different during their training engagement. She wasn't just executing maneuvers, she was thinking several moves ahead, using psychology and terrain and physics in ways that conventional training didn't teach. "The missile sites were the real problem," Rodriguez continued. "I couldn't stay high because they would have had clean shots at me, but I couldn't stay low because the fighters would have boxed me in. So I started flying between them, using the missiles themselves as a weapon." "What do you mean?" Morrison asked. "Surface-to-air missiles are heat-seeking," Rodriguez explained. "If you can get an enemy fighter between you and a missile site when they launch, and if your timing is perfect, you can make their own weapons work against them. It only worked twice, but twice was enough to even the odds a little." Morrison felt a chill as he realized what Rodriguez was describing. She had been using enemy missiles to shoot down enemy aircraft, turning their own weapons against them through precise positioning and timing that required skills beyond anything he had ever imagined. "The extraction took 14 minutes instead of 12, Rodriguez said. "My fuel was gone, my ammunition was gone, and I had taken damage from missile fragments. But everyone got out. The special ops team, the helicopter crews, everyone." As they approached the Miramar traffic pattern, Morrison found himself looking at Rodriguez's aircraft with new eyes. The pilot flying beside him had survived a combat engagement that should have been impossible to win. She had protected the lives of fellow service members through flying skills and tactical thinking that existed far beyond the realm of conventional training. The tower cleared them for landing, and Morrison watched as Rodriguez executed a perfect approach, despite having just shared one of the most harrowing combat stories he had ever heard. Her flying remained as smooth and professional as it had been all morning, giving no indication of the memories she carried, or the extraordinary experiences that had shaped her into the pilot she had become. As they rolled out on the runway and taxied back to the flight line, Morrison realized that his entire perspective on air combat had been fundamentally changed by one training flight with a pilot whose reputation had been built in the crucible of actual warfare. The morning had started with him planning to evaluate a new squadron member. Instead, he had been given a masterclass in combat flying by someone whose skills had been proven in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. The debriefing room at Miramar had seen thousands of post-flight discussions over the years, but Morrison had never approached one with quite the same mix of humility and curiosity that he felt as he settled into his chair across from Rodriguez. The standard procedure was for the senior pilot to lead the discussion, analyzing the training evolution, and providing feedback to help improve performance. Today, Morrison found himself wondering if the roles should be reversed. Lieutenant Colonel Chen joined them for the debrief, along with Lieutenant Walsh and 2 other pilots who had been conducting their own training exercise in the adjacent airspace. The room had the familiar smell of jet fuel and coffee that permeated every marine aviation facility, but the atmosphere felt different somehow. Word had already begun to spread through the squadron about Rodriguez's identity, and Morrison could sense the heightened interest from his fellow pilots. Chen opened the discussion with her typical direct approach. "Gentlemen and lady," she said with a nod toward Rodriguez, "let's talk about what happened out there today. Morrison, you were flight lead. How did the new pilot perform?" Morrison found himself searching for words that could adequately describe what he had witnessed. "Ma'am," he began, then paused. realizing that conventional performance metrics seemed inadequate. Captain Rodriguez demonstrated flying capabilities that exceeded anything I've encountered in my 14 years as a Marine aviator. The room fell silent. Coming from Morrison, whose reputation as both a pilot and instructor was well established, such a statement carried significant weight. Rodriguez remained seated quietly, her expression neutral, showing none of the pride or satisfaction that might have been expected from such praise. "Elaborate," Chen said simply. Morrison turned to Rodriguez. "Ma'am, with your permission, I'd like to share some of what you told me during the flight." Rodriguez nodded once, her green eyes giving permission for Morrison to continue. What followed was a detailed account of the engagement that had earned Rodriguez her call sign. As Morrison spoke, describing the tactical situation and the flying techniques that Rodriguez had employed, the room grew increasingly quiet. When he reached the part about using enemy missiles against enemy aircraft, Lieutenant Walsh audibly caught his breath. Chen leaned back in her chair, her experienced eyes studying Rodriguez with new interest. "Captain Rodriguez," she said, "is Captain Morrison's account accurate?" "Yes, ma'am," Rodriguez replied simply. "And this engagement, this was part of your previous assignment that remains classified?" "One of several, ma'am." Chen nodded slowly, and Morrison could see her processing the implications of having a pilot with Rodriguez's combat experience assigned to her squadron. "Captain Rodriguez, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need a direct answer. Are you here because the Marine Corps wants you to share your knowledge with other pilots? Or are you here because you needed a break from combat operations?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Rodriguez took a moment before answering, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same quiet confidence Morrison had noticed from their first meeting. "Both, ma'am," she said. "The Pentagon wants me to help develop new training protocols based on lessons learned from recent combat operations. But they also recognize that I needed time in a non-combat environment to process some of what I've experienced." Morrison found himself respecting Rodriguez even more for her honest answer. Many pilots would have tried to downplay either the recognition of their skills or the acknowledgement of their need for recovery time. Rodriguez had the confidence to admit both. Chen turned her attention back to Morrison. "Captain, based on today's flight, what are your recommendations for integrating Captain Rodriguez into squadron operations?" Morrison had been thinking about this question during the entire taxi back to the flight line. "Ma'am, I recommend that we reverse the normal integration process. Instead of Captain Rodriguez flying wing while she learns our procedures, I think the squadron would benefit more from having her lead missions while we learn from her techniques." The suggestion was unprecedented. New pilots, regardless of their experience, always started as wingmen. But nothing about Rodriguez's situation was normal, and Morrison realized that conventional procedures might actually waste an extraordinary opportunity for learning. Rodriguez spoke up for the first time since the debrief had begun. "Ma'am, if I may suggest a compromise?" Chen nodded for her to continue. "I'd like to continue flying wing positions for the first few weeks," Rodriguez said, "not because I need to prove myself, but because I need to understand how this squadron operates before I can effectively contribute to improving its capabilities. Every unit develops its own culture and its own way of doing things. I need to learn those patterns before I can suggest modifications." Morrison found himself impressed once again by Rodriguez's approach. She could have easily accepted his suggestion and immediately assumed a leadership role, but instead she was showing the kind of tactical patience that had probably kept her alive during her combat deployments. Chen approved the plan, and the formal debrief concluded with assignments for the following day's training schedule. As the other pilots filed out of the room, Morrison found himself walking alongside Rodriguez once again. "Can I ask you something personal?" Morrison said as they headed toward the squadron ready room. Rodriguez nodded. "How do you do it? How do you fly with that kind of skill and still stay humble about it?" Rodriguez stopped walking and turned to face him. "Captain Morrison, do you know why they call me Sticky Sick?" Morrison realized that in all the stories he had heard, he had never actually learned the origin of the call sign itself. "It's not because I'm good at air-to-air combat," Rodriguez explained. "It's because I have a tendency to get stuck in situations where the odds are impossible, and someone needs to stay behind to make sure everyone else gets home safely. That's not a skill I'm proud of. It's just something that seems to happen when I'm around." The explanation revealed something fundamental about Rodriguez's character that Morrison hadn't fully understood before. Her exceptional flying abilities weren't the result of ego or ambition. They were tools she had developed out of necessity. Skills that had been forged by repeatedly finding herself in situations where other people's lives depended on her ability to do the impossible. Over the following weeks, Morrison watched as Rodriguez integrated seamlessly into the squadron's operations. She flew wing with different pilots, learning their individual techniques and preferences. She participated in briefings and planning sessions, offering suggestions that were always tactful but often revolutionary. Most importantly, she began sharing her knowledge in ways that elevated the capabilities of the entire unit. The training evolutions became more challenging as Rodriguez introduced scenarios based on her combat experience. Pilots found themselves facing tactical problems they had never encountered before, learning to think beyond conventional doctrine and procedures. The squadron's overall performance metrics began improving dramatically, but more importantly, Morrison could see that his fellow pilots were developing the kind of adaptive thinking that might someday save their lives in real combat situations. 3 months after Rodriguez's arrival, Morrison was selected to lead a deployment to the Mediterranean. As he reviewed the personnel assignments for his detachment, he noticed that Rodriguez was listed as his deputy commander. The role would give her operational authority over combat missions, a significant vote of confidence from the Marine Corps leadership. On their last training flight before the deployment, Morrison found himself flying wing to Rodriguez for the first time. The role reversal felt appropriate somehow, a recognition of how much their relationship had evolved since that first morning when he had asked about her call sign as a casual joke. As they climbed out over the Pacific, Morrison reflected on everything he had learned from flying with Rodriguez. She had taught him that true expertise wasn't about dominating others or proving superiority. It was about using your skills to make everyone around you better, to increase the chances that everyone would come home safely from whatever challenges they faced. "Sticky 6, Morrison said over the radio. "Thank you." "For what?" Rodriguez replied. "For showing me what it really means to be a Marine aviator." There was a pause before Rodriguez responded, and when she did, her voice carried the warmth of someone who had found a new home with a new squadron family. "Thank you, Morrison," she said, "for giving me a chance to remember why I love flying." As they turned toward home, 2 FA-18 Super Hornets cutting through the clear California sky, Morrison realized that he had been fundamentally changed by his encounter with the pilot behind the Sticky 6 legend. The morning that had begun with a casual question about a call sign had evolved into a profound lesson about skill, humility, and the true meaning of military service. Rodriguez had proven that heroes weren't always larger than life. Sometimes they were quiet professionals who did extraordinary things simply because those things needed to be done, and who carried their achievements with the kind of grace that made everyone around them want to be better Marines and better human beings.